G'day, ZiggyD here, back with some more Grim Dawn. In this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Demolitionist Mastery, giving you guys an overview and guide to the different skills. So in general, the Demolitionist is sort of your ranged and explosives expert, though she also has a fair bit of potential synergy with other classes through certain skills. So jumping straight into it, the main sort of replacement attack that the Demolitionist has, the one that you're going to be spamming a lot of if you choose to go that route, is Fire Strike. Now Fire Strike adds fire damage and % physical damage as well, but it also has quite a few nice passives that you can put on top of it. So I'll give you guys just a quick example of how Fire Strike actually works. You can see you can pretty much just use it to explode mobs with your ranged attack. Now it also works on a melee weapon, but you don't get all of the benefits when you use it with a melee weapon. So let's kill off this zombie here, and we'll jump back into it there. So for example, Explosive Strike adds extra physical damage, but also gives it a small radius AOE effect. Now when used with a ranged attack, it causes that small explosion, but with a melee attack it does not. It only benefits from the extra physical damage. You'll see that it also has a chance to burn with a certain amount of burn damage, and the amount of burn damage scales with the skill as you level it. Next up in the passives you also have Static Strike, which gives a chance to do additional lightning damage quite a bit, and also a chance to knock down. So as you level this, both the chance of lightning damage, the amount of lightning damage, and the chance of knockdown increase. With knockdown being on a basic low cost skill, because this only costs 3 energy per level, having a % chance knockdown on that you can increase over time can actually be quite powerful as you level that up all the way. And then the final passive on that is Splinter, which adds additional fragments, extra fire damage, and extra piercing damage, just for a nice damage buff. So if you choose to sink a lot of points into Fire Strike, it can be a very, very potent ranged ability. So the other sort of basic starting skill you get is Stun Jacks. Now Stun Jacks do a small amount of electrical damage over time, but they also stun or hold your enemies in a certain spot. Now these start off with 3 projectiles, and I'll throw some down and try and use them on some mobs to give you guys an example. They start off with 3 projectiles, but through one of the other passives you can increase the amount of time they do. So they have a short timer before they set off, but if you can actually hit mobs with them directly, which I'll try to do here, you can see that the burn damage goes up. And now you can actually hit mobs with that directly. It's just tricky to sometimes do. The actual projectile will have to hit mobs. So they can be used to buff out a little bit more damage if you sink a lot of points into it, or just as a general routing sort of skill. Now the upgrade for that adds extra projectiles, so as you can see I now throw out 4 projectiles instead of the 3, and adds extra lightning damage and stun duration, so pretty good ones there. Now Flashbang is an interesting one. Flashbang doesn't do any damage itself, but it does 2 very, very good things. The first thing is 50% chance to confuse targets for 3 to 5 seconds, which essentially takes them out of the fight for that duration. Very powerful, again, like a lot of status effects in this game at the moment. They don't work on bosses, unfortunately. The other thing it does, however, is reduced defensive ability. Now the way that defensive and offensive ability work in this game is that your offensive ability, which I'll go over to the character sheet here, stacks up against the enemy's defensive ability. So basically if your offensive ability is higher than the defensive ability, you're going to be hitting more often and you're going to be critting more often. So what this means, if you flashbang opponents and then attack them, you're much more likely to get critical hits. So I'll just throw out a flashbang just to show you guys how it works. Pretty basic, just targeted skill like all the other ones, and creates this sort of area of effect flash there that essentially allows you to deal a lot more damage to mobs and makes them, some of them, less likely to attack you. Now the upgrade for that adds onto that an extra chance to fumble, which means they can't hit you very well, and then chance of impaired aim, which is essentially the same thing there. So that is a nice defensive addition to that. If you're using a lot of flashbangs, that's also going to increase your survivability as well. Now Molotov cocktails give you a small burn damage area of effect on the ground. So this is good for zoning out mobs, or if you know mobs going to be running this area, but it's quite small and it's actually quite hard to get mobs to stand on that. Overall I'm not much of a fan of this skill, but I could see that it could potentially have potential. So as you level it up, it does have its radius increase though, so it becomes more and more useful as you level up. And the burn damage is, there's an initial fire damage from the initial explosion, and then there's a fairly potent burn damage which can level up. Now the passives for this adds extra duration, and adds extra fire damage, and also reduces your enemy's armor. So that's a nice one when combined with flashbang, and when you're doing a lot of fire strikes and things like that. You can combine those three things to make you're able to deal a lot more damage. And then the final one is agonizing flames, which increases the burn damage, improves the duration of the burning effect, and reduces the damage of your mobs as well. And it also has a 15% chance to terrify targets for 3 to 5 seconds, which basically is fear from any other action RPG and makes them run away. So kind of a difficult skill to use effectively, but it has potential if you want to sink all the points into it, like a lot of the skills in this particular game. Now the next one is Blast Shield, which you can actually see is active in my character there. That light that comes up every now and then is the Blast Shield. Blast Shield does not have a duration, so it does not run out, but what it does instead is it has a set amount of damage absorption. So at level 1 that's 100, and it scales up quite quickly as you level. However, it's not a percentage sort of scaling, so I wonder if this skill will have limited use towards endgame. But basically, it can absorb a set amount of pierce and fire damage, so removing that damage from getting through to your life. On top of that, it also adds fire retaliation, which is like thorns damage, which damages mobs when they attack you, basically. Now the passive for Blast Shield, which is quite impressive, is Temper, which adds extra physical damage, extra pierce damage, and armor on top of the other defensive benefits. Now, so this by itself, because it can last and it doesn't have a duration, can be a really, really strong offensive buff. And this is one of the reasons, just this skill alone is one of the reasons I reckon this class will synergize really, really well with the soldier. Putting a lot of points into Blast Shield and into Temper, I think on top of the soldier's other defensive buffs, I think could be very, very powerful. So the next skill we have is Grenado, and I am quite a fan of Grenado. I'm going to run out somewhere for you guys to use it, but it's essentially a single grenade with a fairly powerful blast. So let's go find some zombies to throw this at. There should be some around here somewhere. Here we go. So you can sort of stack up enemies, throw the Grenado at them, and it'll set off on a timer. As you can see, it just obliterated that particular zombie. Also, if you hit enemies with it directly, it will explode straight away as well. So as you can see, I did that there. So that bypasses the timer, which can be quite useful. Now, in terms of what this skill does as well, it does fire and physical damage. So as I said, the Demolitionist is very good at speccing into both of those damage types, but it also has a % chance to knockdown, which scales with level. And knockdown is a very, very good defensive sort of thing. So having a chance to knock down on that can be quite powerful. And this is the sort of a skill I want to sink a lot of levels into for that reason. On top of that, you have the high impact passive for that particular skill, which adds internal trauma, which is kind of like a bleed effect, but works similar. It's basically a damage over time for 90 damage over 5 seconds at level 1, for example. This also increases it gives you a chance of increased physical damage, so every now and then your grenade will do a ton of extra damage, kind of like a crit. And then on top of that, it also increases the knockdown duration. So if you sink a lot of points into the base skill, then increasing the knockdown duration is going to make it even more powerful. On top of that, you have the Skyfire Grenado, which has extra electrical burn damage, so that adds on top of the internal trauma damage over time, giving you another damage over time effect, and also gives you an initial lightning damage. So kind of just diversifying your elemental damage types a little bit, which will be quite useful against fire defensive mobs, I imagine. But as this is a fairly high level one, I haven't really been able to test it out yet. So the next skill we have is Canister Bomb. Now I'm a huge fan of Canister Bomb, and just like the other one, I'm going to run out and find some zombies to slay with it, because it is very impressive, especially if you can find a large group. So it's essentially a grenade. It functions very, very similarly in its base effect, but it also has small cluster grenades that that shoot out from it. So if I throw it here, it'll explode out, and then a bunch of little clusters that'll go off around it. Now those clusters and the initial grenade can do quite a lot of damage even at low levels. So jumping back into the skill tree here, we see it does fire and physical damage, and it has a set amount of fragments there, and the damage scales as you level it up. It also seems to have reducing energy cost, which is pretty good, another good reason to level it up. Now on top of that is improved casing, which also gives internal trauma, so another damage over time effect, which with the cluster grenade seems really good for taking down large packs. As you can see here, I've only got 1 point in each, and I've been using this to just absolutely slay large packs of enemies. It also increases the fire damage and slows enemies as well, which is a nice little bonus there. 33% chance to slow, which with all the clusters means you're going to at least slow a few mobs each time. And the time on the slow scales as you level. So you're still only having 33%, but extra slow time, which I don't think is a very big deal. Now, the next passive is Piercing Blast, which increases the fire and physical damage, and it adds 10% extra burn damage with 10% extra improved duration, so increasing any burn damage that you happen to put out there. And it also adds a little bit of piercing damage on top of that. Not a hugely impressive passive for the skill. I think the actual main skill and the the secondary passive there are the ones I'd be sinking a lot of points into. Now the Mortar is interesting. Basically you spawn a little companion that doesn't move, which I'll throw one down here. I'll find some enemies that it can shoot at. And it shoots its own little grenades out, kind of like the Grenado skill, very similar to that in function. But if I put this out here, you can see that the little Mortar will fire its grenades out. Now the big problem I have with Mortar is that sometimes grenades will miss, and that's kind of like a mechanic in the game where, you know, even though an enemy is standing in an explosion, sometimes they'll just miss or be deflected, which kind of feels kind of cruddy. But also the Mortar has a hard time hitting moving opponents, so combined with like the stun jacks it can be quite good, but it's actually very hard for the Mortar trap to do a lot of damage against a lot of opponents, especially if you're having to kite around. Now the passive, the first passive for that is Heavy Ordnance, which increases the damage overall, adds extra lightning damage, quite good, and also gives you a chance to stun, which is nice. But again, still pretty hard for those grenades to hit. And now there's the ultimate one as well, which works only on the Mortar, and it gives the Mortar a skill that it'll use every now and then, I believe. I haven't been able to test it. Adds extra physical damage, quite a lot of physical damage, fire damage, and also slows mobs. Now the big problem with this again is that if it's anything like the main Mortar attack, it's going to be very difficult for it to actually hit anything. So Mortar is kind of lackluster in that reason there. Now the next one is Thermite Mine, and this one's a lot of fun. This one also spawns little creatures. Each time you throw out the Thermite Mine, which I'll do here, they spring out into 1, 2, and 3. Now when enemies walk over the top of these, they set off the thermite mines and there's a fiery blast that appears above. So I'll throw this out and I'll try and lure this mob onto them. So as you can see, the fire shoots up. Any mob standing in that small area of effect will take quite a bit of fire damage and will be whittled down. Now you can have 6 of these out at any one time, so you can throw it twice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now obviously that just does quite a bit of damage. It's good for zoning out, especially if you can throw some stun jacks on top of it to keep enemies on the fire. And then the passive for that adds extra fire damage and lightning damage on top of that. So as you can see, with you level with the Demolitionist, you get a lot of different electrical damage on top of your fire damage. So electrical burn damage, kind of, you know, they kind of go pretty well together, and diversifies out your you know, fire capabilities with some lightning capabilities to balance things out a little bit more. I'm going to throw some more thermite mines just on this zombie here, and we'll stun jack him there to keep him on. He died instantly. So the ultimate ability for the Demolitionist is Pyrotechnics. Pyrotechnics, I'm correct. Which is actually kind of more just a passive ability, so nothing too spectacular. Obviously the more active one is the big one for the Mortar, but again, I've already voiced my issues with the Mortar. Now Pyrotechnics adds a lot of extra fire damage and a lot of extra burn damage, with improved duration as well, and also gives you a nice little bit of fire resistance on top. So a nice passive, and considering the Demolitionist doesn't have any other passives by herself, probably a good one to grab once you get up there, but not something I would be rushing for really. You'd probably get better effect by sinking points into the main skills that you're using. So overall, the Demolitionist has a lot of potential as sort of a Grenada herself, sinking a lot of points into energy and trying to crit with your grenades and put out all these different status effects. Very, very good AOE capabilities overall. In terms of dual classing synergy, I think you can combine it with the Occultist to make sort of like a Pyromancer build focusing on fire damage. Otherwise with the Soldier, as I mentioned, combining things like Blast Shield and maybe even Flashbang to improve your crits and things against enemies, I think has a lot of potential. Anyway, pretty fun class to play with so far. Really quick to level compared to the Soldier because of that AoE capabilities. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this overview of the Demolitionist. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.